Hey, all right, we're live. Actually, I meant to ask you there, Jason, before we did go live. Is my sound okay there? Loud enough on
You
your end?
sound
Yeah?
great to me. Yeah, you sound
Okay,
good to me.
perfect, excellent. I moved the mic a little bit further away, and I just want to make sure it's good. Anyways, thank you very much, Jason, for joining me on this live stream today. I really appreciate it. And for you folks who are in early already, this is going to be live streamed to my X account. It's going to be on Jason's X account. It's going to be on Jason's Rumble channel, his YouTube channel, as well as my Rumble channel and YouTube channel. So if you can't find it, well, you're just not fucking looking hard enough.
Fair enough.
But basically, yeah. Anyways, so basically, like I was mentioning to Jason before we went live here, there's a couple things. The main topic of conversation is going to be a post that Jason had put out on X, and me and Jason follow each other. I pay attention to his content, and I think he pays attention to mine. Anyways, basically, it's not my king, and it's basically a movement to try to change things up in terms of the political system in this country. But before we get to that, there was a couple other items that I actually wanted to deal with, and I brought it to Jason's attention. So let me bring this on the screen here real quick, because as you know, folks, the institutions, and we're even seeing this in the U.S. in terms of the activism. So it's not just within the institutions, but actually even within the courts. And we're seeing even Trump trying to do his thing down there and being blocked constantly by these activists on the bench. And if you think they're activists on the bench in the U.S., well, that goes all the way up to the Supreme Court in Canada. And here's what the Supreme Court is sharing with us Canadians today. I'm sure some of you folks have already seen this. I kind of shared it a little bit earlier, but basically this is right from the Supreme Court of Canada's X profile. And it says, "Dear subscribers, moving forward, we will be focusing our communication efforts on other platforms. We invite you to follow us on our LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube accounts to continue receiving our updates. Thank you for support." By the way, their YouTube account only has like a couple hundred subscribers. So I don't know. And a lot of their other, even some of their other accounts and profiles have a much smaller following than they do on X. So it kind of makes you wonder, although it doesn't make me wonder a whole lot, but it would make an average person wonder, why would you want to remove? And the fact that X, as we know, is that one platform where we have genuine freedom of speech, where we can actually say what we want to say without, being, silenced or suppressed. Well, heavily suppressed. I'm not saying the suppression still doesn't happen, but we're definitely seeing that we can say more things today on X than we can on some of the other platforms. Well, I mean, Facebook, we know we can't even share news on Facebook. Well, you can if you're really inventive, good at screenshotting and doing other things. There are workarounds to that restriction, but X is the dominant platform for most of us these days to go to. It is the proverbial public square, and the Supreme Court is, for some reason, I would say it's very political in nature, is making it so that we're not even going to be able to interact with them on that one platform where you actually can say things. So anyway, I just want to get your reaction to that there, Jason. What do you think?
Well, I'm going to have to echo Eva Chipowicz there. This is very disappointing. This is very disappointing. And I think you nailed it. This is a political message. This isn't about we're not getting engagement or we're not reaching the audience, because we absolutely are. You can see even in this post, it's 700,000 impressions here. They have a large audience when it comes to X.
Yeah.
And if you're just strictly just going to provide Canadians with information, you need to be on X. We have a lot of things, like you mentioned, with Facebook and other platforms, because of Bill, I think it was C-18, that kind of suppressed a lot of the news on these platforms. You need to use things like X that are not to do in the suppression of news. So I don't see the logic, if you're going to make the argument that it wasn't beneficial to the Supreme Court to use it as a way to reach Canadians, because most certainly is. So there has to be another reason. And I think you're nailing it. It's political. And I got to remind everybody here, the Supreme Court, we have Chief Justice Richard Wagner, I believe it is. He came out and was anti-occupation. He was using the term occupation for the protesters in Ottawa. And this was before we had the decisions of the federal court when it comes to, we had some lawsuits that made our way through. The Mosley decision is a big one. And we learned very quickly after those that it was improper. The government overreached. But yet we had the Chief Justice already coming out with his political statement saying it was an occupation. So this worries me to my core. Do we really have a judicial arm anymore? Or is it a political arm that looks like a judge?
Yeah, that's the most disturbing part, is because that was the whole pretense anyways, of both of our, whatever you want to call them, democracies, republic, whatever, however, but the whole point of having the Supreme Court, the legislative branch, the judicial branch, and the executive, now they're a little bit described a little bit different between our both countries, but you do have those three different levels of government that are supposed to be the checks and balances. But this is a problem that people like myself, and not just myself, many others, and especially if you're a reader of historical books, is this is the thing, and the reason why the founding fathers drafted their constitution to try their best to restrain and restrict power at any level is because they understood, as most human beings at that time understood, that humans are corrupt. What was it Lord Acton himself said? That power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So even the most saintly a person, you put them in a charge of too many things, and they can quickly turn quite tyrannical. And sometimes it can be done even under the guise of benevolence, as we're seeing, and in particular under Trudeau, or at least, I don't know if he's Machiavellian, more of a nincompoop as far as I'm concerned. I don't think he's got the intelligence to be Machiavellian, to be honest with you. But we see that power has that very corrupting nature. And when you have a Supreme Court, so this would have been, you would have to, everyone, I would imagine, on that court, unless they did it by democracy or a straw poll, I don't know how they do it, but they basically agreed that the people, that's the other thing, folks, we pay all of these people's income. We are their employers in the way it's supposed to, or at least that's how we're taught in civic class and things, right? We're the boss, we're the voters. And yet, as we're seeing, so the establishment media, Jason's probably familiar with this as well. I started out years ago. I used to comment on CBC's website. Right now, I found out years ago, yeah, they were disabled quite readily if you said anything that was, against the grain. So I gave up on that. But you could still comment on their YouTube channel. Well, nope, they closed comments on that. They basically, even now, actually, if you go to CBC's website, before it used to be roughly 70-80% of most articles were open for conversation, for commenting. Now you're lucky if you get like 10%, right? And usually that 10% that is still left open for commenting is very milk toast type of stuff, unless they want to know engage your opinions. That's when they'll let you chime in, but it's very heavily controlled, and our voices are heavily silenced and suppressed. And the problem that we are seeing, people like me and Jason and many others in Canada, is without the reach. So we do have freedom of speech, so we can speak on X, but the problem is if we don't have the freedom to actually reach other people, right? So basically, I think what we're allowed today is to echo. We're allowed to function in our echo chambers, but we're not allowed, seemingly, most of us, to get outside of those. And that, in a population of 41 million, right? I got, I don't know, however many thousand followers or in Jason, but that's a small number in comparison to the larger population, right? So we are still functioning in an area where most of our peers in our country are getting their information from people from either side of the political divide, and mostly one side of that divide. And no one is allowed to step in and offer an alternative perspective, something like Jason or I would offer. And that is a huge, huge obstacle and barrier, whether you're a supporter of democracy or not. But if you are, democracy can only work if we actually are properly informed, have the knowledge, right? And that's the point of the vote, right? The vote is, it relies on an astute and informed population. But if you have a population that is overwhelmingly indoctrinated or propagandized with, basically single-sided narratives that are based on ideologies that a lot of Canadians would disagree with if they had proper understanding, then we're in a really, really precarious situation. But I know I kind of went on a bit of a tirade there, but if you want to follow up on that at all there, Jason, go right ahead, man.
Yeah, no, you're bringing up a whole bunch of good points, and I hope we can get into a bunch of them as well, because the town square is gone. Like it used to be, you can walk into the town square and have your say. People don't have to agree with you or like you or anything like that, but you can go ahead and do that. One of the purposes is to kind of give your opposition to what other people are saying, and another opportunity was for you to have a way to speak as well, to get your new ideas out. Like we like the idea, I think it's in our human nature to have ideas and to share them and fresh. So when someone starts to control that and try to manipulate it, and excluding certain types of ideas and amplifying other ones, then you get into some very serious trouble. That means somebody's got the levers and the knobs that are controlling the culture and controlling the message, because you nailed it. Information is the key to this.
Yeah.
So when you have a town square that's gone all digital and has got big logos and corporations protected by the government itself, making it difficult for other ones to come in there and establish themselves, and also helping the large ones stay in power by working directly with them in various ways, like muting or blocking or deleting messaging. And it works both ways, because the government protects them in that space. They allow them to have that. Licenses, other means is where the government, controls that. And I know we're going to get into smaller government, because without government in place, this digital town square wouldn't have been taken over by just some players. So
Right.
I would like to see a way for us to stand up on soapboxes a little bit more and have these conversations. But you and I know, because we get shadow banned all the time, getting blocked, getting deleted. It happens all the time. And we're just, breaking in there, starting to get our voice out there. We have this illusion of freedom of speech, but we've heard terms like we don't have freedom of reach and we don't have freedom of preach, which means you're up there telling people, here's where I think, here's what I'd like to see, and here's some change that I'd like to position to you.
Yeah.
But I think what we're doing right now at this moment, having these conversations, getting out there, sharing platforms, mine, yours, others, asking people to take a moment to share this out there to get it going, is a way to kind of get into that platform and into that digital place to have our conversation. But it's not going to be enough to start getting to the mainstream and rest of Canada. There's a very protected group when it comes to information, and we are having a hard time breaking into that. We basically have to go door to door to let them know that we even exist, because we don't have a level free market when it comes to information and ideas. And I'm concerned, even with a shift in government to conservative, if that happens, and that's not for sure. Even if we do that, what is that going to look like? Are they going to go shut down the CBC and then start up their own? Is it going to be state media to the other side? Is it going to be a free market? Is it going to be a highly far more restricted market because of what the previous one just did? Like I don't know what it's going to look like, but it sounds scary to me. And I hope a whole bunch of independents like you and I and others stand up and find a way to break through that.
Yeah, well, I mean, even just the fact that I'm sure you're paying attention, and most of the people that would watch our content would be paying attention, is we're seeing now, we all know. So just to parse things out before I get too into it, yes, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. So we're all familiar that polls can definitely be skewed and manipulated. And of course, it has to do with your sampling. Like me, if I put a poll out, especially if it's an online poll, chances are probably a lot of libertarians are going to be the people that will answer. So I'll get a sampling of people who predominantly would agree with me, but I'm not going to be foolish enough to say, well, that's a representation of the country as a whole. But that's how a lot of these pollsters do. And they'll pick certain people from certain sampling. But once again, they're never getting my perspective because they're never asking my opinion. So we know they can be definitely manipulated and skewed. But even if you just go by the fact that it's people that typically take like the Angus Reid polls or the Abacus, or so that would be a representation of a certain portion of our country. So that is a real thing. And what are we seeing today is without people like our voices being out there so that you can actually have that reach, so that you can be that counter voice to the establishment media, then what we're seeing today is, Pierre Poilievre, and once again, I got lots of critique for Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives, tremendous amount. I'll reserve them for a little bit later, perhaps, but they were on a big tear, because Trudeau, and it wasn't even, I don't think it was anything that Pierre Poilievre was doing. I mean, his 3-worded slangs or slogans, right? Like axe the tax, fix the road, whatever, right? It's like, that's not very fucking inspiring, to be honest with you. But I think what was happening is the Liberals themselves, just by their policy based on how they were treating Canadians and their nonchalantness about the way they were treating a certain demographic or segment of the population, that alone was the reason why and most of us Canadians seen their popularity greatly decrease. So policies and the way they were going on. But if you look today, not only is that divergence actually closed up, now you're getting to the point where some of these polls today, now once again, yes, they can be skewed, manipulated, but those same polls that were showing, a 20 plus point lead, now they're basically, it's a toss up between the Liberals and the Conservatives, which tells you that the establishment media, and it must be great when the establishment media are reporting on these polls, because really when the establishment media reporting on these polls saying that the Liberals have now gained all this ground, really what they're doing, you wouldn't see it, but they're patting themselves on the proverbial back is what they're doing, because they are the very people who are informing the population. And as you can see, they're quite good at manipulating the minds of Canadians and convincing them to, yeah, Trudeau bad, but Trudeau 2.0, Carney, right? Trudeau on crack, Trudeau on steroids. He's somehow good, but they've managed to sell and spin that narrative, and to the point where they're not just encroaching on the majority lead that the Conservatives had, but now they're basically upended it entirely. So this is a really important thing in terms of us being able to have a voice in this. Now, I there's something I want to bring up, Jason, there, but if you want to even just springboard off that while I bring this other piece up. The other part about Jasmine that we were bringing?
Sure. Yeah, we jump into that right after this little Carney thing, because you're bringing up a very good point that people need to pay attention to, and that's Carney. And I noticed that you didn't say Freeland or mention any of the other candidates, because I think it's pretty clear who's going to end up winning this one. This was pretty clear to some of us who've been paying attention for a while. If you look back at some of my posts and my shows, a year and a half ago, we were warning Canada that Carney is going to be the next PM. And a lot of people were confused. They're like, well, he's not an MP. But as we now know, and Canadians should be paying attention, you don't have to be an MP to become a PM. The powers that be are the party itself. The party puts forward the leader, and the Governor General, through the King's blessing, will go ahead and appoint that person. So the Canadians outside of the Liberal Party itself will have no say in who our next PM is at all. And this has happened before. John Turner, he was our 17th Prime Minister. He succeeded Pierre Senior. He did the same thing. He resigned, and the party picked a new PM that had no seat in the House. At least he previously did. So at one point, Canadians did support this gentleman, Turner, but this is not the case even for Carney. Carney hasn't been in office. And we got to start looking at this more like a uniparty. I think you mentioned this a few times, because Carney was appointed to the Governor General, or to be the governor of the Bank of Canada by Harper in 2008. So these people all get along. And if you're talking about the global banking level, of course they do. Okay, that's where the money is. And that's exactly how you control populations, is through the financial systems. And Carney, people need to pay attention, has been an advocate for over a decade now of a central bank digital currency and having a lot more control when it comes to that. He's not about to let his legacy die. He wants to see that come to fruition. So I think this is why he's taking a chance to become the Liberal leader now. I was expecting him to come later. I was expecting the Liberal Party to take the L and pass it over to their cohorts, the Conservative Party, for a few years, and then come back maybe with Carney. But with them bringing Carney forward before that election, I'm pretty sure they have a plan to go ahead and take that power. And I don't expect a snap election, an early election, because they're not in it for a couple of weeks. Carney didn't show up for a couple of weeks. He showed up to continue his legacy. And his legacy is central bank digital currency, social credit scores, and UBI. UBI has been on his radar for quite some time. So I just want to highlight that before we move on to this next segment, that Carney is a threat to Canada. And if you don't even care about his WEF connections, which he's openly supporting, at least take a look at what he did at the banks that he was in. And if you want to, don't take my word for it, go listen to Liz Truss, who was the Prime Minister of the UK, who said, be wary of this guy. He prints money and it causes problems later. So don't just take my word for it. Let's listen to the other world leaders who have actually worked with Carney and said, be careful. This is not the direction you want to go. It's just going to get worse for you. And I think they're correct.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, before we actually do move on, I just want to reiterate the fact that with the digital, so a CBDC and a UBI, and I kid you not, folks, and the people that typically watch me, I just say things the way they are, and I'm not trying to be overly alarmist, but I got to tell you, folks, if I think of all of the things that have been done already, the ultimate, and this is, I'm not being hyperbolic here at all, the proverbial last nail in the coffin is if you do end up with a CBDC and UBI. You're basically, the government controls, once the government controls you that much, right? And there's no, once cash is no longer a thing, once everything's done in digital form, well, not only now is the surveillance aspect of the state basically omnipresent no matter what transaction you do, that you can't get away. But just like in China, they have the ability. So if they can not just monitor it, and if they have control over your currency, well, they can also take that away. So that's the thing in China. You're punished and penalized if you don't have a certain, credit score, if you do something, if you insult dear leader, right? And make no mistake, folks. I mean, we've seen the precedent is already here how far they're willing to go in terms of taking the reins of power if it's handed to them. We see that COVID was a perfect example of just how far people that you would normally think are, hey, they're not that bad, but you see at that point the tyrannical tendencies that reside in a lot of these people. And I mean, you don't even have to get to politicians. I'm sure each and every one of us knows that. I don't know if it's the dad or the mom that raised their kids, and it seemed like they were constantly giving their children a lot of goodies and stuff, but a lot of that times, and we all grew up to know this, it was all about control. It was constantly, the parent that wanted to give and take. It was a lot of times about the control, and they were scared. Maybe it was they didn't want their kid to leave home or something, but there's always some reason or justification. And sometimes they'll even convince themselves that it's for benevolent reasons. But the simple fact, the undeniable fact is the minute there's a CBDC, and it's something like Jason was saying, it's something that Mark Carney is definitely a big fan of, and the Liberals have already introduced UBI. It got to, second reading before they had to call that election. The only reason why it hasn't been implemented as of yet is probably as a consequence of that election. Maybe they were holding the power dry for just times like this, but this is another example. And I got to tell you, for the young people in particular, because for older Canadians, I don't think the UBI is going to be that appealing, right? Because a lot of older Canadians are probably going to be at least old enough and wise enough. They're going to be like, yeah, that kind of sounds a little bit like a trap, but that will appeal to young people. And young people who are really at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, that is who they're going to try to appeal to. And the biggest thing I want to tell, and if any of those young folks do get a chance to watch this live stream at some point in time, I want you to know that it's just the same thing like that controlling parent. They're not doing these kinds of things out of benevolence. They're basically they've destroyed the economics of things so badly that they basically have to set another floor. They're admitting that even minimum wages, that was the whole point of minimum wages, right? Was to try to create a floor. So you couldn't get below that. But as you can see, the reason why they have to keep raising the minimum wage is because they keep fucking our money over so bad that they have to go. So now the minimum wage, the whole new thing now is the UBI. But the UBI, once again, being promoted by the very same Mark Carney. And that Mark Carney, if you're a young person and you're today in your 20s, 30s, and you still can't start your family, you can't get yourself into a home, rent is ridiculous and sky high. Mark Carney, and as Jason pointed out, and I've pointed out in the past, who was directly appointed to be the Governor General under Stephen Harper, and Stephen Harper himself was in power during the financial crisis and the subsequent fallout of the financial crisis. They together combined to bail out all of our big banks, and not just to the tune of, to recapitalize them. I mean, they bailed them out as if they were underwater and they had to buy every share in the company. And then, so the reason why the housing market, which of course, a lot of the older people benefit from that. So if you didn't want to see your $1 million house all of a sudden become worth what it's actually worth, well, you supported this kind of stuff. And I'm not blaming any particular individuals. I see how it was beneficial for some of the older folks. But once again, a lot of people are coming to realize, but it was at the expense of your kids and your grandkids. And that's a terrible thing, to sacrifice future and success of generations. Well, not only is it terrible and unethical, but as an older person, don't you realize that those are the people you're fucking over are the people you're going to rely on, in your later years. So it's even stupid for you at the individual level if you're an older person. But yeah, if you're a young person, Mark Carney and the kind of policies he wants to implement, don't fall for the snake oil, folks. It's going to be, the costs are not going to be imposed on older Canadians. The costs are going to be imposed directly on you and your own kids and grandkids. So you got to think about these things and not just worry about that quick fix of, oh, he's going to give me a little something in the here and now. Because as we've seen, every time this happens from government, the little bit that you get, you pay twice, maybe 10 times as much for, right? So that's anyways, that's kind of where I want to go. I don't know if you want to say anything else there, Jason.
Yeah, let me
Yeah,
kind of tack on to that because
sure,
I'll
yeah,
explain to the young people who are watching exactly
yeah,
how this works because you're right. It's their future that's being sold down the river right now. And they
yeah,
may not understand what that means. It might just be words to them. Take a look at
right.
what's happening in Ukraine with the US, where it comes to this 500 or $300 billion loan or whatever it is. So
Mm,
at one point, there's some money got transferred to the Ukraine, and the US said, "Hey, we want our money back." And how did they do it? How are they going to do it? Future resource development. So
mm,
where rare earth minerals and other development within the Ukraine is now going to be owed to the U.S. as a way to pay back. This is
mhm,
very important to pay attention to because this is exactly how they do it. These are the assets of the sovereign country that are
mhm,
now being pledged for future payment. So when
mhm,
Canada goes into deficit spending and they print money, don't think in your head that they just type some numbers into a computer or just start printing actual physical money. What they
mm,
do is they issue bonds and other things in order to
mhm,
have uh, commitments from countries and International Monetary Fund and global banks and other organizations that you probably not even familiar with, but they're going to have a direct impact on your future. So what
yeah,
they do is they hold the future assets. And what are the future assets for Canada? Well, our labor and our resources, everything that's
mm,
coming down the pipe. Things that we
yeah,
haven't done yet, developed and provided to markets. So if you can imagine that as a young person just starting off, getting yourself an apartment maybe or something like that, but here's a student loan. Like you have a student loan, you have a
mhm,
long-term debt to somebody who's going to be taking 30%, 40%, maybe even 50% of all your future revenue and income until you're paid it off. Well, imagine that now on a country level, and we're not talking millions or even billions, we're talking trillions. So
mm,
trillions of our future worth is already being spent now. Why? Because this gentleman known as Carney wants to win an election. So he's going to buy an election. He's going to spend like 4 or 5 months worth of payments to you. It's going to look great in your bank account. You're going to have a couple thousand in there and you go, wow, that's great. Let's keep that going. But let's remember, like just what we just heard you say right now is it's going to come back at 10, 20, 30 times the cost now.
yeah,
I want to
yeah,
also point the young people to Greece. Greece ran into this problem. They
yeah,
had a large loan to the International Monetary Fund, and when they were defaulting, and we watched this in the news, and we watched the people in the streets rioting over, "You need to feed us. Don't pay the money here." But they're defaulting. They
mhm,
defaulted. So what ended up happening? The International Monetary Fund comes into the government and says, here are the conditions and terms in order to service this loan going forward. You're going to pay us X amount of your income tax directly. We are going to instruct you who to work with on the market level when it comes to your resources. You're going to allow these companies to come in and help redevelop your economy. Like this is when your sovereignty is now gone. And now Canada's absolutely on a fast track for that. Not only are we overspending already and we have a huge deficit now, $1 trillion was spent by the Liberals in 10 years. We're
mhm,
now talking about spending even more. And Carney came out and warned everybody in Kelowna just a few days ago, maybe a week ago now. He said, I'm going to use the Emergency Act in order to
yeah,
enforce this, and I'm going to do deficit spending. Well, we saw what the Emergency Act means.
mhm,
Canadians are unhappy.
yeah,
Let's just leave it at that. Canadians
yeah,
will be unhappy when it's invoked. So
yep,
this is what we're looking at now. It's going to be forced down your throat. You're going to look at your bank account and say, "Great, I got $2,000 this month," and then the election's going to come up, and you're going to have to decide: Am I going to continue collecting money out of this government because
yep,
it's going to look good to a lot of Canadians, or am I going to realize that this is a trap, and we need to stop this and change this? And I'm really hoping that we have a Conservative Party that opposes this. Right now, I haven't heard them opposing the deficit spending. I hope
mhm,
they don't come in with $1,000 a month instead of 2,000, because if
right,
they get onto the bandwagon of saying this is not a bad idea. Because we tariff war, and maybe we should be doing this. If the Conservatives start to support this kind of spending, we're done. Okay, we're done. But at
mhm,
least if the Conservatives fight against it and oppose it, we may have a chance. And I still haven't heard from Pierre. I have no idea what his position is when he heard Carney say we're going to go into deficit spending, because he should have
yeah,
been one of the first. He used to be the finance minister, or at least he played in that role in the Conservative government. He should know how bad this is going to be, but I'm not hearing him. Maybe I'm missing the message. But this is
yeah,
where I'm waiting for the next step, because we know Singh and Carney has already talked about the relief package, so they've already come to terms that there's going to be something. But I'm not hearing Pierre say this needs to stop. I'm hearing Pierre talk about Carney in other ways, but not about this deficit spending. And specifically, I'm looking for this because it scares me. If there's conservative support for it, we are done. If there's conservative opposition to it, we may have a chance. But that's where
Yeah.
I'm standing on this. I want to warn the young people. This is your money and the next generation's money that we're talking about here. We're not talking about being able to have a money tree that we're pulling money from. It's the future labor and resources of Canadians in Canada that's being spent right now.
Yeah. And, in terms of Pierre Poilievre, if there's one thing I've noticed about him and every conservative that's come before him in terms of the leader or any of the prominent voices within the party, is they get all of their, and this is the thing that actually, I don't know when this changed, but even though we live in something, remotely akin to a democracy here, is when did the people actually start to believe, and when did politicians, well, I think it probably post Keynesian economics becoming mainstream after John Maynard Keynes, post World War II. But the major thing is now with central banks is they just function, all the politicians and political parties function on what polls good. So if it polls good, if the liberals, doing UBI polls good, well, the conservatives might spin it in some way, but they both have access to this, basically the proverbial piggy bank of future and successive generations and the power of inflation. So that now there's no limits or restraints that there used to be under something like the gold reserve. There, when gold was actual, you could only print so much money in comparison to the gold that you held. So, and even then they manipulate it to the fraction, so that they got to the point now where there is nothing. There's nothing that restrains them. So either party are kind of trapped in some way. So if one party's offering lots of goodies, and the fact that even people grow up and believe, that's the crazy part. There should be something in your civics lesson or even in your education or people in your own household that should tell you, no, you don't have the right to vote to take money from other people. Like the fact that that's even a viable concept in public discourse. You could talk to 9 out of 10 people and 9 out of 10, or you could talk to 10 people and 9 out of 10 people in Canada, maybe even 10 out of 10, depending on where you're at, are under this belief that it's even legitimate to vote to get things, because these things aren't free. But this is the way the vernacular in Canada is, though, it's free, right? And because we don't actually see the cost directly imposed on us, a lot of Canadians fall for this. But what it is there's a reason why the debts and deficits continue to grow. Those costs are continuing to incur. It's just they're being offloaded further. The can's kicked down the proverbial road further and further. But at some point in time, someone's going to have to pay the piper. But that's something that me and Jason are definitely in agreement that we got to do whatever we can here, folks, to start to educate and inform people, and not just like I say, not just the folks in our own little echo chambers. As much as I'm greatly appreciative of those who are like fellow travelers and followers and concerned about this stuff, I am very appreciative of the thousands and thousands of Canadians are. But once again, we live in a country with a population of 41 million, so we got a long way to go to be able to reach out or to counter the narrative. And this is one area where I'm going to bring on here, where we're kind of going to just bounce into here. I'm not sure if some of you folks probably are familiar with Jasmine Lane. I just started following her fairly recently. She has a pretty good voice, and she hosts a show called Over Opinionated. She apparently was a former broadcaster. Who knows? She might have even worked for mainstream media at some point in time in the past. And maybe I'll reach out to her at some point in time to have a conversation. But here's what she's bringing out. And I'm just going to read for it and kind of give my thoughts and ask Jason on this, because this is an area that I think is something I've kind of bantered about. And it's something I think is really important. And it'll kind of carry along into the kind of stuff we've been talking about. So I'm hereby petitioning for a center/conservative leaning news source that is publicly broadcast in Canada. Now, I would say center or, liberty, just something that's outside the mainstream. But if you want to use whatever vernacular here, center, conservative, that's fine, as long as you do allow for voices like myself. So why doesn't Canada have anything like Fox? Why don't we have anything that goes against the narrative and can be found? Oh, one thing I will disagree with actually is publicly broadcasted. I'm not a fan of public broadcast, and I think this is something that could be sourced and done without using the state as the revenue source. But I definitely agree that we need some kind of of an area where people like myself and Jason can find each other, and just like I say, like in Canada, you know, all the progressives of all different stripes can find themselves at the CBC or CTV, and they can congregate there. But as you know, you won't see people like me or Jason or anyone that's challenging the status quo being invited onto their show. So basically what she's suggesting is that we come up with something where we do have some cross-pollination and people who are anti-establishment, or at least counter to the establishment. Anyway, so why don't we have anything like Fox? Why don't we have anything that goes against the narrative and can be found while flipping through your channel guide or promoted on commercials across all networks and platforms? Why? I also offer my show, Over Opinionate, to have an evening time slot on this network should any investors want to make this happen. I am a multiple award-winning host on #1 performing shows in small and medium markets, and was the recipient of the Leaders of Tomorrow Award, representing hosts in Western Canada 2024, just a few days before I was let go without cause for my individual work and voice in the industry. With 11 years broadcasting background in radio and television, mostly radio, I believe I would be an asset to such a team given my knowledge and background. I don't have the money to make something like this happen, obviously, but if anyone who's rich is thinking about something like this, I'd come out of retirement for you. So basically what she suggested, and I definitely agree with, and I want to get Jason's thoughts on this. Did I actually bring that up here? I just want to make sure. Yeah, that is on there. Okay. Is I definitely agree that you know, we have some great voices in this country, and not just me and Jason. I won't just go dropping names, but there's some decent voices in this country who are definitely challenging the status quo, definitely up against it, definitely having their content suppressed. But if we did have somewhere where we could congregate, if we did have some financial backing in some way, that would go a long way to, I think, being able to give us the opportunity to get that reach. And once again, without having to use the state, I would like us for actually to lead by example. And because I'm against using the state, I'm against using violence or theft as a means to an end, I would like to do this in a manner that's on the voluntary means. And I'm sure, like Jasmine, and hopefully, well, I would imagine you would agree as well, Jason, is this is something that's very, very important. So if there's anyone out there who does have the financial resources and the ability to help make an upstart like this happen, there's definitely enough of us out here in this country, there's definitely enough talent, there's definitely enough voices that this is something that could, you know, if implemented, could be a big, huge bulwark against the establishment media, who constantly has that power to manipulate and distort the minds of the masses, because they have the power of the pulpit, and something where we don't. So anyway, what are your thoughts on that, Jason?
Well, now that you brought this post up, I do remember her, and I emailed her today. So I saw this post as well, because I saw exactly what she's calling for.
Okay.
And she's not alone. And you're absolutely right. There's a whole bunch of us. In fact, there's a lot more going on behind the scenes right now that leads exactly to this. Not necessarily to the point where it becomes like a Fox, where somebody owns it and it's a corporation type of thing,
Right.
but definitely a meeting place for people with voices who want to share it. Right off the top, you know, my concerns would be, let's not make the state associated. Let's not make any tentacles to the government in any way, shape, or form. And also, let's not restrict it to a particular group like conservative or middle. Let's just make it more like a public service that's done by the public without public funding through the government in order to make it happen. This is where private people can get involved. And also, I'm going to kind of give you a little tip, because there's a shift happening in the media right now. The alt media is happening, and it does appear to some of us who have been paying attention that they're preparing for the conservative government to support that version of media going forward. We have the name change for True North to Juno, and we have some people leaving, like Harrison Faulkner, and there's more coming. I can't get into all the names, but there's a big shift happening right now as we speak, Bennett, where there's going to be a surplus of independent minds and journalists who are looking to find a way to support their family. Now, that's the good news. The great news is, through things like supporting via memberships or sponsors or supporters on some platforms, like how I keep my lights on, is working. It does work. There's a lot of Canadians out there with a desire to have the truth, and they want to find the truth. Now, when it comes to getting multiple sources and being able to get more access to it, it's coming. It's coming. So Jasmine, she definitely felt the wind changing, and she understands it as well. And I've already reached out to her. I emailed her, and there's some more people I've already talked to specifically about this. It's got to be done well and right, so that the trust is maintained amongst all the people that are in it. and with the audience, because the last thing we need is another corporation getting us all to, say an ad and talking about investing in gold, the Daily Wire model. I don't think that's what we're looking for. We're looking for something that's no sponsors, it's raw, it's real, it's accountable. You'll see retractions and corrections, and we hold each other accountable too. So
Yeah.
stay tuned, Bennett. And now that I'm familiar with your desire to be part of that as well, I'll make sure that you get an invite to the next conversation about this, because this is what Canada needs. It's not so much should we do it, is we have to do it, because one of the pillars in the checks and balances that we spoke about earlier is media. They're supposed to hold it accountable, hold the government accountable, and the people in charge and in power accountable. But we're not getting that now. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm glad that she's made that call, and she's got a very big audience, and may help get a lot more people like you, me, myself, and others to get together on this.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up actually, because I think I just noticed it a couple months ago, but I've been following Candace, and yeah, she's great. She's been really good in terms of helping to start True North, and once again now has moved over to Juno News. And I realized not too long ago, a couple months ago, that she actually follows me as well. As you can see, I just brought it up on the screen. So actually, that's something actually now that you mention it, is maybe I'll reach out to Candace and to have a conversation about this, because this is something that I think is vitally important. And even for those of us who do want to participate, right, put some skin in the game ourselves. I already helped support other alternative media sites, a couple. I don't have a whole lot of extra disposable income, but this is a kind of initiative that, yes, money, it speaks, folks. You need money to make these operations. Everyone has to get paid. So, I'd even be willing to, even help try to fund in some way some kind of initiative. But this is something that I think is really important, and I'll definitely reach out to Candace. I'm sure if you're having any conversation with anyone else out there, yeah, just let people know that there are quite a few of us out here, and it's not just me, not just Jason, that are really interested in having some platform where we can have, these kind of long form interviews and discussions, where it's not just constantly bringing in, a one size fits all kind of a narrative that appeals to a specific segment. But I want to expand and enlighten people to the point where they get information, because that actually what has benefited me the most, is not just listening to libertarians, but listening to conservatives, to liberals, to all kinds of people from all different backgrounds, religious people, atheists. I mean, I've listened to people from the gamut, the spectrum, in terms of religion, ideology, age, all kinds of parts of the demographics. But all those things, I can't say that any one person has been the one that has given me the kind of knowledge that I've accumulated in my mind. It's been the ability to have all those different voices. It's kind of like putting all a jigsaw together. Listen to all those voices helps paint the picture. It helps fill things in much better than just listening to one-sided narratives, or even one that's pretending to be a debate, but it still functions within a certain particular Overton window. I am a firm believer, especially when you're talking about adults, is just, within the range of just, as long as we're just using our words. But yeah, I'm a kind of a no holds barred kind of guy. I speak openly about the fact that I don't even believe in government, folks. So yeah, and it's not a matter even of choice. It's just a matter I use objective logic and reasoning and an understanding of philosophical points and ethics. And I just like in the past, I would have been one of the people that would have been an abolitionist. I wouldn't have believed in slavery then. I don't believe in the modern form that we have now. So anyways, I guess that kind of will kind of springboard into the fact. So the media is one thing, but the big thing here, what we're really talking about in addition to the media, is what Jason brought on. And I want to bring this actually, which is kind of the whole point why we wanted to talk about this stuff, and why I named this one is Why a Democracy. So Jason created let me bring that up here one sec.
Sure.
Okay.
And I like where you're going with this. I'm so glad that we're having these kind of conversations where we're trying to tackle a whole bunch of different things. We're not focused on a single issue, because we realize there's a lot of issues to address.
Yeah, well, that's awesome, Jason, because yeah, to me, it is really important. And this is something that I wanted to bring up. So like I say, and thanks for putting this post out there. Bearman, I just love the fact that you get people thinking. To me, that's so critical. Even Trump, the Trump effect right now, is as much as people are talking bad about it, but I'm kind of happy to see whether it's good or bad, or it's at least making people, even for the people who hated when we were flying the flag, during the protests, right? Well, they even themselves probably are even questioning, well, why am I nationalist now when Trudeau? So at least it's getting people thinking, that's the thing in these situations. It's actually good to see that there's some discourse and some arguments taking place, because it gives you that room to actually start thinking more critically about this stuff. Anyway, so this is a post that Jason had put on his X account. So Canada, it's time to start taking the legal steps to evolve from a constitutional monarchy into a truly democratic one. Join the movement now, notmyking.ca. And I did click on it. You just have to give an email, folks. You can answer the question and get put on the Jason's list there, and you'll be able to stay on top of all this stuff. Anyways, but my thing was so a new Canadian government by the people for the people. Anyway, so my thing is actually, I might as well, I think my comment should be right down there. So my reply was, what's so great about being ruled over by the mob instead of a king? I am an exception to the rule in Canada because I require no rulers at all. However, I'm always curious as to the reasoning behind the love for authority in this country. Now, obviously, I'm the kind of person, and you folks know me, I like to be a little provocative at times, right? Just to, like I say, just to get people thinking. But I'm not being dishonest. I genuinely don't have any kind of affinity for whether it's democracy. I mean, even the republic we're seeing. I mean, to me, it's not necessarily that the U.S. is a republic. Why the U.S. is having a better shot at standing up for the liberties. I think the important part of it all, the republic at least laid a little bit better groundwork. But I think the biggest difference between Canada and the U.S. is not necessarily the style of government, although I'm sure that definitely contributes. But I think the dominant aspect of why the American experiment and their experiences is, and you're seeing that glaring divide today as opposed to Canada, is because of our history and because of the way we've been taught about government. So the Americans' basis, the very founding, and we've heard these things like, people like Jefferson, like the tree of liberty must be, whatever, refreshed with the blood of tyrants and patriots. These are words you would never hear in Canada. But basically what the founding fathers, when they set up the constitutional republic, because they told the king, like King George, fuck you, right? They knew even themselves, like, yeah, we could turn tyrannical. So let's lay out in our document, and they drafted it, they redrafted it, it was reworded, there was amendments introduced. But the whole point, I believe, of the Constitution was the underlying narrative is don't accept authority. You can create this thing. We could, if we still want to leave space for like the night watchman state, the referee, right, which was the only mistake I think that they did make, but it was definitely a step up comparison to the past and the kind of tyranny they experienced under monarchs. But the most important thing, I think, the American experiment and the story, the meta narrative of the American experiment is never, ever, ever trust authority. That's kind of the key thing. And not just don't trust it, but the Second Amendment is, tyrants don't just come from, they're not just external threats. Matter of fact, most tyrants are come from internal. Our gravest dangers, the gravest threats to our lives, our livelihoods, and our liberties usually come from within, usually come from the state and whatever we function. So that's kind of the starting point for me for this conversation is I'm not against monarchies. I'm against all of them. I just don't think we need rulers, but I'm also acknowledging that just because I don't require a ruler and my mind is in a different place than most, I'm not going to pretend that the majority of my peers are they're believers. They believe in government. So what do we do in that situation or scenario? Obviously, I'm not going to convince 41 million people to get up to speed and adopt the mindset like my own. So in the interim, until that happens, we are all going to have to function under some kind of a state. Now, it could be a monarch, like that was in the past that where our founding come from, same with the founding fathers. Now we kind of stayed aligned, right? So we were more closely aligned with the monarch, but there was at least some move away from it to the point where, like, let's hedge, right? So we created our own little parliamentary system and at least made most of the power of the monarch kind of not really not kind of real power, more like soft power, more like rhetorical power. But at the end of the day, the system that we've seen is turned quite tyrannical. And because of the way our Bill of Rights is drafted and has been written, is we don't have, like the US, it's well drafted enough that there's enough of a pushback that you can, as you see in the US, you can kind of try to fight back against that stuff. in the rhetoric or the field of law or using legalese. In Canada, because the laws are drafted that basically says that we don't actually have fundamental rights. We have basically privileges, because that's basically what Section 1 and Section 33 does. It basically tells us that the government has some pretense of authority, and the courts believe this, the legislature believes this, right? The executive, they all believe that the government has this ability to deny our rights. Now, they have to make some justifiable reason, but once again, that can be quite arbitrary and something that's easy to do for sophists and people who understand how to speak that kind of legalese. But the biggest concern we have here is, what are we going to do going forward? And I want to ask Jason, so this is where I'm curious as to what you mean in terms of a democracy, moving away from the fact that we're a constitutional monarchy. So what did you actually have in mind, Jason?
Well, let me kind of set this up a little bit and remind people what a government really was meant to do, because I do think even on your level, you would agree that there's some function to it. And that was to just kind of give us some protections, because we have our rights that we're born with. Okay, let's set the stage properly. These are not government given rights. They never should have been. We're born this way. And the fact that we've allowed the government, and by handing over some of these rights in order to get protection, security, and liberty, and all the good stuff that's supposed to come with the government, we've compromised. Now, what I think people kind of forgot was the whole purpose of these documents, whether it's a constitution, bill of rights, it's to limit government, not to limit people. And we've allowed the government to flip that on its head and treat it like privileges. They are providing it to you. So my idea is, let's have another new conversation. We saw what happened in the US in 1776. They had to revolt. They had to use their firearms. And really, if you break down what the beef was, it was they identified government overreach, and they know the slippery slope, and they wanted to make sure it didn't continue. So at first, the UK said, hey, yeah, go over there and colonize. You can send a bunch of stuff to us. We'll do a bunch of trade. But they weren't doing things like taxation. And then they came along and said, hey, we're going to tax that tea without even asking you. So this is where the whole representation or taxation without representation came from. And they realized at that point, this is a slippery slope. If we start with tea, it's going to be then the next thing, and then the next thing. And before you know it, it's going to be our labor. It's going to be everything. So they understood quickly, because they watched it happen before, that this is a slippery slope. So we have to stop it now. Canada didn't do that. Canada continued to have that understanding and relationship with the monarch, which felt like, well, you created the Magna Carta, so you've created privileges for us. You've released us. You've given us this rule book. And we kind of stayed on that path where it was more the government gave it to us, or the queen or the king gave it to us, and we were servants, and we work with them. We still live on crown land. Like, you don't even own the land. It's crown land. So you're still treated like the serfdom, like that type of mentality.
Yeah.
Whereas the U.S., they went the complete opposite. They said, no. We're going to stop this. You're foreign to us now. We're going to be our own independent colony. And then it became the United States. And then they grew from that. So what I want to say to Canadians is, let's have another conversation. And we don't have to do a revolution anymore. We can do evolution, like we're pointing out here. Jamaica's going through it right now. Okay. So they're passing the bills through their parliament in order to turn to a republic. And the conversation I want to have is, let's become a constitutional democratic republic. Now, there's a special word in there, democratic. It's not just constitutional republic, because in the U.S., their system was the forefathers. They sat down, hashed it together. They had their 13 colonies, I believe it was at the time, and they came up with the Declaration of Independence. What I'm going to propose to Canada is, let's all be forefathers. Let's be part of the process. That's the democratic portion of it. We're all part of the process to define the republic itself. So do we have a prime minister and a president, or do we just have presidents? There's a decision that needs to be made if we're headed into a republic. So that would be an example of where the people should be the ones defining that, not a group of forefathers in the back smoky rooms coming up with the ideas. Quite literally, I think we're now reached a point in the evolution of democracy where people can be part of that conversation now. We can all have a little piece of the forefather responsibility and role and have our say in it. And then what will come out of it is a republic defined by the people. That might be a very unique way of creating a republic, but I think that's a good way to look at it in this modern time. I think we're wise enough, smart enough. We learned from the Americans. They had to do a bunch of amendments, which are basically an admission that, oops, we didn't get the original document correct. We had to amend it a bunch of times, which is good. I'm glad they have that mechanism. But now we can even learn from those mistakes. Like, freedom of speech is paramount. It's core. being able to protect yourself against future government is core. So the right to
Mm,
bear arms, these are
mm,
necessary. And it also has to be built on the belief that it's God-given rights. These are not government-given rights. So we have to be very, very clear. And I think Canadians, this is the one thing that they can actually get on board for. Not only is only 23% of Canadians in the last poll suggesting that they actually align with the monarch, but here's a time where if you align with the Democrats, or maybe you feel like you're a Republican, maybe you're a bit independent, or you're a libertarian, this is one issue that we can all get on. Let's become a republic. And then the day after the republic's done, those groups can go ahead and start politicking and going to become the first president, because that might be the very first thing we need to do. Once we
mm,
declare a republic, we need to now elect a president. But I can see Democrats, Republicans, independents, and libertarians coming together and changing the system and working on, through a democratic process, a new republic. And I think this would be a great model for the rest of the world and the other countries that are still part of the Commonwealth to consider. This would be a great template for other countries to go ahead and have a public defined republic, so a democratic process for it. Now, I don't like rule by mob, because if you asked everybody, should we hand out all resources to everybody equally all the time, they would say yes, but then
yeah,
we have no way to advance or improve or improvise and become industrious. So
mm,
I think we understand that mob rule isn't the best way, but a
mm,
republic which has representation and mechanisms in place like recall to go ahead and give you the power to pull out people who are not doing their job, put in new people that are doing their job, and do it through a trusted system. I think in that mechanism, not only will libertarians have a voice and have representation, but we all will. And then from
mm,
that point on, well, it'll be typical things. It'll be the Democrats versus the Republicans, and here's our ideas. We want to head in this direction. Here's our ideas. We want to stay in this direction. That will happen. But I think this will bring Canada together, at least for a month, while we define this and put it
mm,
out there and start a new republic. And I think this is our only good path forward in order to deal with things like globalism and the idea that the monarch has different intentions. And I had a
mm.
great conversation with Jim Ferguson this morning from the UK, and
Okay.
there's support for Canada to go ahead and stand on their own 2 feet and be independent fully, not
Mm,
just have a couple more ties to the government. Like, this should be Canada's land, not Crown land. I should
yeah.
be looking at Superior Court, not King's Bench. And I
Mm,
definitely want to make sure that when we have a change in government, a change in leadership, it's via an elected position. So our head of state right now is the king. It should be a Canadian who was elected. We should have a vice president. So if for some reason someone has to resign and step down, we have succession, which includes somebody who was voted on by the people. This is
mhm,
why I like, the vice president idea versus what we're seeing here with Carney. Carney's
mm,
going in with no votes,
yeah.
but he's going to run us. And
Mhm,
I think that that's something that Canadians should pay attention to, because that's not democracy. That's not democracy at all.
mm,
So I'm pushing for this. I think the time is right. It's almost a perfect storm. There's a whole bunch of reasons why Canadians are having this conversation now. Trump has ignited the conversation. Carney's ignited the conversation. And the king let us down under Trudeau. There were times where the king should have stood up and said, look, you're going too far. That's the whole
mm,
purpose of still being involved. That's why the king is supposed to be the head of state, is because the king is supposed to step in when we go too far.
mm,
We didn't envision that happening, but we also didn't envision the Emergency Act, our greatest law, being used against Canadians illegally. We now know this through the Mosley decision, and the
yeah.
king was nowhere to be found. So we have this, break in case of emergency mechanism with the monarch that didn't work. So I think that was the last straw for me. We didn't actually get any protection out of that relationship that should have been there for us. They failed us, and he's
Mhm,
demonstrated to us what we can expect more of, because
mm,
he's not saying anything about Carney stepping in. Carney's talking about the Emergency Act already, deficit spending. Like, this is a really bad thing, and
oh,
we're
yeah.
getting nothing out of the current monarch. So I think it's time to let them go back to the castle and do their thing. I don't think they need to be destroyed in any way, shape, or form. We just need to do what Jamaica's doing right now: make the decision, do a resolution instead of a revolution, and finish this and finally become independent as a full country.
Well, I like what you're saying, James, but I'm just going to, and the reason why I do this stuff, and the reason why I wanted to have this conversation with you is because, just like with myself, I love listening to other people in case I have blind spots. But here's my kind of a little bit of a pushback to it.
Sure.
And I'm going to try to invoke my inner Trump here for a second. No, but in reality, actually, Trump is actually kind of the person that kind of got me to the mindset where I am in terms of this stuff. So the whole thing with Trump, right? That the one thing that nobody can deny about Trump is the man is all about the deal. That is his thing, right? He's transactional. And
Kind of like you wrote the book, you think?
right, exactly. And the whole point, and he'll even say this, right? So he doesn't even leave. It's an open secret, folks. And we're seeing even now with the 51st state stuff and basically the way he's even handling most of the files internally and even foreign policy is you just go just full on as your starting basis point. And for me, as a Canadian, what I would suggest to you or anyone else who's willing to engage in changing our, whether it's from having a king, a monarch, or a democracy or a republic, your starting point for me as a Canadian, I think it would benefit every one of us, right? So this is I'm in this to help as best as I can to start us from the best negotiating starting point, and that would be just like the founding fathers. They would have basically told you didn't get the memo, right? We didn't get the letter or from the pigeon who carried the thing or whatever it was back then, but basically the starting point of their negotiations back then is we don't recognize your authority to do any of the things that you claim to do over us. And with that starting point, with that basis, right? Sorry, that you're running around, you're naked, the emperor's naked, and acknowledge that you don't have it. I think as the basis, and this is the area where I think libertarians shine, is we just acknowledge that. I get it. We're going to pretend that this thing is legit so that we can have some kind of a night watchman state or a referee. I get it. But my starting point of any negotiation is going to be, I don't believe in your authority at all. And I think you end up most likely, I'm not a predictor or anything. I don't have a magic 8-ball, but I think you end up in a much better spot at the end of negotiations if you start from a point of, you have no authority over me, rather than accepting that authority, because then I think they kind of bend your will to they're the ones that are going to use the language of the Constitution and of legalese. Whereas if you start, like I say, as the basis, and it's not like it's unprecedented. It's not like it's even an abstract impossibility. I can actually prove, if you want to even just entertain there with me, Jason, but you can prove in just a few simple questions, that there is no such thing as legitimate government and how we've been explained how it plays about. And actually, without even going into the full questions, just for the time's sake, because people can go watch my content, the 4-question quest for freedom, is you don't even have to go that. Just simple fact is, I don't have any authority, and nobody would ever suggest that I have an authority to take anything from my neighbor against his will, any money. Nobody would ever think that I have any authority to dictate how my neighbor lives. And I guess the simple thing, like I say, you go through this in my whole 4-question quest, and it'll actually help you, think through this yourself, is if I don't have that authority, well, how do I delegate an authority that I don't have onto someone else? Magic doesn't exist, right? There's no, we have to live in an objective reality. So if I don't have that authority, I can't delegate that authority to another individual, nor can I delegate that authority to a group of individuals and call them politicians. So government, by having objective knowledge, using reason and logic, deducing and problem solving, there is no such thing as legitimate government. And if you present that as your starting point, I think you end up in a much better negotiating point. And I think at some point in time, because yes, I don't think humanity, or I don't think Canada, I don't think the US is going to be going full anarchist at any time soon. I don't expect that's going to happen. Like I say, that's about the mind evolving, and it'll take generations of that, and it has to be enforced horizontally and from top down, to the point where, just like with the slavery in the past, you don't have to beat that out of people's heads today. People that's their default position now, is, of course, slavery is illegitimate. It's highly immoral, but it wasn't that way. The belief system back in the day, until people, philosophers and others, right, explained to them the ethical implications of slavery, most people believed it because, once again, they were taught that it was horizontally enforced by the people around them and taught to them in their education. So, like I say, if we can at least, as the basis point, get as many Canadians, which is why I think it's important for us to have these kinds of conversations, because I'm sure your audience, or a substantial portion of them, have probably not heard of the fact that there's no such thing as legitimate government. And I know it sounds really shocking, folks, and it was to me when I first started thinking about these things, because, yeah, I mean, it's just like when I was growing up in church, and I know my grandmother took me to Sunday school and church. It's just like if someone at that time would have told me that there's no such thing as God, it would have been. And it was, because I had to break through both of those paradigms, actually, whereas there's not a magic man in the sky, although I still like to believe in a God in terms of a concept, in terms of, the great stories and the fact that something outside of the realm of humanity kind of keeps us in check. I like that idea. But once again, I don't actually believe that there's a gray-bearded man sitting in the clouds somewhere. But it's the same with the state. It took me a long time, and I need a lot of information. I needed my own personal observations. I needed to work through a lot of stuff in my own brain to figure this stuff out for myself. So like I say, I know this is it's a long, protracted process, but I think it's something that we really should get to. And it's not, like I said, it's not because I want to eliminate the state tomorrow. I just want people to be in the proper mindset so that because like you were saying, it would be democratic, right? I'm not looking to impose my will on everyone. I want my fellow Canadians, right? I don't care what your background is. I want us to all be actively engaged and nobody to walk away from any potential scenario in the future where one side got to implement their form of government and impose it on the other. So if we can get as many Canadians, prominent Canadians in particular, people who are money people or movers or shakers, people in the media, people who are educators, all these kinds of people, politicians, as many people as we can to get up to speed. And once again, you don't even have to, even if you don't want to listen to me, because maybe I don't present the information in a manner that's conducive with your kind of type of learning. Probably half of the books I've got here will tell you almost the exact same thing I'm telling you, maybe in a much better way than I am. And this stuff has been figured out for hundreds of years. So it's not like Bennett Hunter somehow, I've magically figured it out. I'd love to be able to give myself that proverbial pat on the back. No, but I'm just standing on the shoulders of geniuses in the past who have figured this stuff out. So I just think, like I say, can't wait to hear your response there, Jason. But like I say, I just think it's really important for us to get more and more Canadians up to speed, not as a means to get everyone fighting, but just so that they can start at a position of negotiation that may have to happen at some point in time going forward, where we're in a much better position to do so, no matter where you fall on that political spectrum.
Now, I like a lot of things that you're saying, because I certainly would want smaller government or almost close to no government. But I'm going to take us to the problem of being a neighbor downstream. So as much as we want to be able to, sit on our land and do our thing, and we don't think we're impacting our neighbors, that's only true if you're not one of the ones downstream. So let's say you are developing your land and the neighbor upstream decides, well, he has to put his waste somewhere. So he decides to put it into the water. Well, when you're downstream, that suddenly becomes a you problem, even though it wasn't one that you created. So this is where, working in your neighbors, working with them, and maybe even having some sort of government that makes decisions like, hey, maybe we shouldn't put that in the stream, but let's pool some money together and create a septic system that we all share. So one larger system that one person couldn't do. So let's do that. And then, things are going on great, but you're still downstream. The guy upstream, suddenly he wants to irrigate his land and he wants to grow a lot more because he wants to provide it to the farmer's market, because we're having an economy and we're starting to develop. But now he's taking a lot of the water and there's very little water for you downstream. So once again, you're going to need that government to kind of adjudicate that conversation. And now we have aqueducts and septic, and we're all trying to prosper. When it comes to resources and being downstream of your neighbor, this is why some sort of government needs to be in place. Because as much as we believe we can have these conversations and do well as individuals, even with just our neighbors, there's bigger pictures sometimes, even generational pictures. Let's make sure that septic system goes for 50 years instead of 5 years. Let's make sure that aqueduct is going to supply growth all the way to 5 generations from now. Let's plan ahead. And those are the kind of decisions that not necessarily individuals can do, or even the resource allocation that individuals can do. So there needs to be some sort of...
Let me just say that, Jason, because like I say, I get what you're saying, but everything, and I assure you, every example that you can think of where you need my government, I've heard a gazillion times, and every one of them can be easily. So what you really mean is you need an arbiter or some form of dispute resolution mechanism. That is what you need at the end of the day. And we already, every one of us already do that on a regular basis through contractual obligations. And really that's what we're talking about. And the thing is, historically, these kind of things would have been much more difficult to implement absent the state. But in the modern world of smart contracts and social media, and once again, I mean, everybody has cameras these days. Everybody, I mean, it's so much easier now. Well, I mean, perfect example. Let's just go 20 years ago. You could have made the argument then, and it probably would have been really hard to argue against it. That, well, man, how are we going to go to space, right, without government? Well, government, but it wasn't government that got us to space. It was individuals. Now, it just happened to be that government was the one that used the resources. They plundered other people to soak up the resources to find a way to pay for these things. But people like Elon Musk have come up with a business model. Now, of course, there are subsidies, but doesn't need the subsidies, but he's come up with an actual private sector business model who has completely supplanted the need for government to go to space. Matter of fact, Elon's company, SpaceX, is actually in the midst right now of negotiating how to bail out the astronauts who NASA has stranded up on the space station, because NASA does not have the capacity to bring these astronauts back down to Earth. It's only a private company. Same with telecommunications. Historically, you needed government for the infrastructure for telecommunication, because a lot of it would have had to do with eminent domain, right? For the infrastructure to build for our telecommunication. Satellites functioning hundreds of miles up in the sky, or up in space. We don't have to worry about eminent domain. We can have all have internet access, no government need or necessary. It'd be same with any, like I say, Jason, trust me, 100%. Like I say, that's just a couple examples, but every time you think where there's some place like with the water, it's the same thing, contractual obligation. People that are going to live in a community are going to want to have other people held to account. And the people who don't want to hold to account, just like now, there's lots of people in our own society that there are all kinds of laws on the book, but they don't follow them. So there's always going to be examples where you're never going to have that perfect scenario where we can all hold each other to 100% account. But the beautiful thing about actual market or private contracts is, and because they're usually written in a manner that's clear and concise, can't be manipulated, and there's nobody that's going to walk into these things believing that one party has ultimate authority over everyone else, right? So no, if you go to a dispute resolution organization instead of the government to mediate, some argument or dispute, well, both of you are going to have to read the contract and what that arbitrator or that mediator is going to offer, and make sure that it's going to be as fair as possible before you're ever going to sign on that line. So those examples there are kind of a pushback to the need for government. But anyways, I see you're kind of shaking your head, so I'm sure you have something to say.
I sure do, because I've actually gone through some legal training in Ontario. I became a licensed paralegal there. It's not just a secretary or assistant in Ontario. Paralegals are licensed and regulated. Now, yeah, I'm pushing back because you shot yourself in the foot a couple of times on your arguments. One of them was, people don't always follow through. 100% correct. And you made a comment that contracts can be clear and concise. So that is not true. We wouldn't have courts if that was true. If we were able to do that, that would be true. That would be great, but I don't think so. The problem is enforcement. I like one of the pushbacks I'm going to give back to you right now is the reason why private contracts work is because there's a place like a court that could lead into some sort of enforcement, including sheriffs taking your property in order for you to, go through the contract that you agree to. Without that enforcement stage, contracts are as good as the two people involved. And you already highlighted that is an uncertainty. In an ideal world, everybody will do exactly what they say they will. But even above and beyond that is interpretation and the changing of the environment. So even though you have a great contract, you and I say we're going to take 50% of that river, and that's it. Great. Well, then the river just kind of change of environment. The river changed its path, and now it's only on your land, on your square. And now I'm saying, well, wait a minute, can I sell that 50%? You're like, no. Our agreement was when it was running between both of ours. Change in environment, something changes. Intentions also can change quite easily. You pass away, and then your family, your kin are now taken over. Maybe they have different ideas about the river. So things change. Like what I'm trying to highlight here is the best way to have good communication contracts is when there's an enforcement stage. Ideally, you don't need it, but if it's not there, there's very little causing the human to go ahead and continue with their agreement.
Well,
and I do agree.
You kind of just proved my point though, because you said that you need this, you would need to think about if you were. So once again, you're proving my point that if you were going to sit down and have a contractual agreement, you would be thinking of all these scenarios. And so with the other
Only
person,
when there's enforcement. So who's doing the
well, of course, yeah,
enforcement?
there has to be enforcement. That I
That's
would never
that's my
deny
next
there's
question. That's not gonna be the
right,
mediator or the facilitator. That's not gonna be that
right,
person.
right,
You're gonna
right.
need an army or some sort of local enforcement.
Well, not an
It does
army, but something along the lines of like a police force. You're not going to need a military.
anything. Let's just call it enforcement. So in
Right.
contract
Yeah.
enforcer,
Yeah.
maybe they
Yeah.
just say CF on them, contract enforcer,
Right.
and that's their
Right.
full
Right.
job. But they
Right.
can take physical action like your property
Yeah.
and auction.
Yep.
Like they have
Yep.
that. That's still government, whether you just want to call it contract enforcement. And if you don't do
No, but
that
that's
through some
no, but
sort.
that's the thing. The difference of that here's the point, Jason. That's not government because
That's
government
where we're going to
is
differ because
no,
I think as soon
well,
as you have a third party involved, you're allowing someone else to make decisions for you, and that is governance. Whether or not you're an elected person,
governance, but not government. So governance, yes, like
well, government would be the institution of governance, right?
I govern in my household, right? Like I am
Correct.
the government in my
You're the king of your castle until you're no
right?
longer the king, right?
But my kids, like and technically I could always have used violence or force as a means to an end, but my kids, I didn't raise my kids that way. So they recognize that, I have the enforcement powers, but I would never use enforcement powers as the means to an end because once again, at some point in time, and it's not out of benevolence, it's out of
No,
the rational self-interest. It's that, yeah, I can use violence as a means to an end, but they might end up growing up at some point in time. And if might make right is the way I function, well, then I can expect an eye for an eye, right? So yes, there has to be a means or a measure for accountability, and that enforcement mechanism has to be there. But once again, the difference between how we humans function today is the reason why we live in the world we are today, where there's so much taking place, is that belief. Now, I don't believe, just like I have a contract with Amazon and Walmart, if I go buy stuff, I don't believe. Now, Walmart could screw me over, right? Or Amazon could not uphold their end of the thing, but it's the fact that they want to make. There's always that rational self-interest for most organizations to try to make whole. Right now, they could get away with, like you say, messing someone up for some reason, but they're probably not going to last very long, especially in the age of information and the social media sphere. Because as soon as people find out that they're not holding up their contractual obligations, then people aren't going to obviously use their services or their products anymore. And that's the thing. It's the belief. I don't believe, and neither does Walmart or Amazon have an army or a police force, but we would definitely have a way if we were entering a negotiation that there would have to be some kind of enforcement. But that enforcement arm, none of us, neither you or I, would think that enforcement arm could then somehow create like an emergency act or do all or just print money out of thin air. The reason why all that happens today is because people believe that government has that kind of authority. Whereas if we did things in contract, it's not going to be perfect. Of course, there's never going to be a perfected system. I don't believe ever, to be honest with you, but it's that belief. It's the belief that the other person on the other side of it doesn't have any kind of actual authority over you other than the fact that to maintain that particular contract. That's it. There's no belief that they have the ability to do anything outside of that contract. And that to me is the big distinguishable difference between something like a dispute resolution organization and government.
well, and I don't totally disagree with you because a lot of things you're saying is true, and we don't necessarily need a full government institution for like a big blanket over everybody. We see
Right.
things like co-ops working quite well for
Mm.
communities. We see that as well, but there's some more challenge to try and be completely without any type of government.
Mm.
But
Oh,
what I
for
think
sure.
what we can totally agree on is if we're heading towards smaller government and more
Mm.
localized and regional decision makers, then
Yeah.
we're onto the right path.
Yeah.
And if we can get that all the way down to so limited government that there is a mechanism where when there's a dispute, we actually just
Mm.
go take it to an arbiter and we agree
Right.
that, yeah, that's the third party arbiter, independent. We're happy with that. But
Right.
let's
Right.
say I can snap my finger and overnight all government's gone. I think
Right.
the very first thing you and I would do was sit down and create a criminal code. That would be the first thing we do because we're going to try and set some limits to do we have property ownership and what if someone tries to take it? What's trespass? Trespass
Mm.
criminal
Mm.
code. There we go. First line of criminal code. Thou shall not trespass. Now you see what we're getting into. Immediately, we're going to start talking about how not to kill each other
Hmm.
and what happens if you steal. Like, we're going to go to the 10 Commandments and just break it down into a criminal code. That would be the first conversation we have when government's gone. And then from
Right.
there, you're going to find pretty quickly some establishments are needed, like prisons. Like, once we kill
Mhm.
somebody, what do we do with that person? Are we
Yep.
going to eye for an eye, or are we going to try and rehabilitate? What's better for
Right.
society? This person's beyond rehabilitation. This person's not. Right there, now you're in courts. You're now having criminal court conversations and stuff like
Yep.
that. It
Yep.
would be pretty quick before you realize we're back in a government, because we do need some sort of governing. Now, I think our overlap is very, very similar when it comes to, it should be reactory. So it should be reacting to something. A
Uh,
meteorite hit our town. Now let's react to that as a group,
hmm.
but not, hey, a meteorite might hit our town. Let's put all our resources into all of this stuff that makes a few people happy and rich so that we can have meteorite protection services, when there's real no reason to do that, because it's never really happened before. And that's
Hmm.
where government can get out of control and overreach, because some guys think, oh, the sky is falling, the sky is falling, so let's go ahead and put all our resources and stop that. That
Hmm.
would happen too. So I'm
Right.
absolutely for a government that reacts to things and not necessarily tells you that bad things are coming and then let's put all our resources in that way. If we can
Right.
be smaller government that reacts to things, work on a criminal code and certain types of enforcement, we might
Mhm.
get far closer to exactly what we both want:
Mm.
peace,
Well,
peace with our
that,
neighbors and prosperity.
yeah. Well, that to me, like I say, so that to me is, so once again, so we're not getting bogged down too much in it, because once again, I am not suggesting that the state is going to vanquish at any time, but once again, we're seeing the big divergence between us and America right now, and not just us in America. The UK versus America. America is truly being that beacon, that one sole beacon now in the world, where at least a sizable portion, half of it at least, is standing up and fighting back against globalism, the establishment, the way things are currently done now. And you just have to know, or at least I talk to a tremendous amount of them, to be honest with you. I have a lot of relationship with a lot of Americans, because as a libertarian, that's libertarian central is America. Anyways, but it's their mindset, right? It's that mindset. So they even have a state. They have a behemoth of a state. They actually have a larger, more dangerous apparatus than we have, even in Canada, to be honest with you. Their state apparatus is much more dangerous than ours ever could potentially be. Like, their military is massive in comparison, to contrast to our little ragtag bunch that we got there, maybe 60,000 or so. So the threat is always omnipresent of internal tyranny as well. But what keeps that bay best is the mindset. And of course, the Second Amendment is the next most important factor in that, which, like I said, even the Japanese emperor said of the day, like, I would never invade mainland US because there's basically a gun behind every blade of grass. So
Mhm.
it's the mindset and your willingness to defend yourself against, like I say, tyrants, externally or internal, or any threat to your life or livelihood or your property, right? So that to me it's not that I want or expect that the state is going to exist. I just think we as Canadians, and the sad part is there's too many of my fellow Canadians that have a loathing and hatred for Americans. But I think we should actually try adopt more along that kind of a mindset. I actually think the way things turned out, it actually should have turned out the other way around. I think Canada, we should have been the country that ended up with the most liberty-oriented population, because of the fact that we had a pretty harsh fucking place to have to settle. Our forefathers would have had to undergo not just the same kind of political strife and bullshit that the Americans had to, but in a much, much harsher climate for the most part. So I think that Canadians should be in that space. Actually, I would like to see us do even better than America. So once again, at the end of the day, I'm not saying that, like, I'm not advocating that we're going to go anarchist anytime soon. I'm just saying if we can adopt more and more of us could adopt that mindset of, we don't need authority, or if the things that we do need authority, let's use innovation. Let's use our entrepreneurial mindset. Let's find ways to function outside the state. And then at some point, that's actually how I think the state ceases to exist, is just at some point in time, we keep finding out new ways to circumvent the government thing and using some other thing to supplant that. Just like I said, with the space thing and with the communication and all the other things, right? Just like, with the roads, like, actually governments don't really build roads. The only thing that you needed government for was, like, mostly would have been for, like I say, to take property if someone's house was in the middle of where you wanted to build your roadway. But like I say, there's always ways, and we're seeing more and more today, especially in the modern world, where a lot of this stuff has already been taken care of, where some of these concerns are no longer pressing and things that we have to concern ourselves anymore, right? Even in terms of the Trans-Canada, we don't even really have to build multiple different highways so that we'd have problems with eminent domain. You could go below, you could go above and use the same kind of space, but have multiple levels. So there's all kinds of ways where you could figure out some of these societal problems absent of the state. And I think that's actually the area where we get to where we don't have to, and kind of you even use the terminology, which is I use all the time in terms of evolve. I don't want to go through revolution, Jason. I'm sure you don't either, because that shit turns out bad for a lot of people. And even if I end up surviving that ordeal, there's going to be a lot of pain, suffering, a lot of death. And that's not something I'm happy to engage with or entertain. So like I say, the biggest thing that I try to do today is I have access to a microphone, the camera, and people like yourself, Jason, and whatever audience is willing to listen. And I just say that the thing that we should be trying to do is get our mindset in the right place, getting more of our fellow Canadians' mindset in that right place. Because I think if our mindsets are in the right place and we have the right ideas and the right goals, then I think we as people can find a way to come together, because that's the thing we're going to have the biggest concern with is we need to do it so that liberals and New Democrats, socialists and conservatives and progressives, and we need to figure out how all of these people can agree. And to me, as far as I'm concerned, the only way we're at this point in time, because people are so untrusting of each other because of the fact that government is that big, gigantic guy in the room and everyone's scared to death that their opponent's going to grab it, is if we can lay out a situation or scenario where it's like, okay, the gun, it's there if needed for when those dangerous situations, but we've at least in our minds placed it in such obscurity that we've now figured out we've basically there's a 1 in a million times that we're even going to think, hey, we don't need that gun. You know what I mean? So I think that's the overarching narrative that I try to present is I'm not under any illusion that we're going to vacate the state anytime soon, but let's try to adopt that more of a mindset of that individual liberty thing. And in terms of how it's going to play out, whether it's a democracy or a republic or whatever the heck it ends up, it might be something that neither you or I have even thought of up to this point, right? I don't know what it's going to be at some point going forward. But the most important thing is, can me and Jason and the rest of us in Canada, can we kind of go about our life, do our things without having to constantly have to look over our shoulders, because there's so many people in our country that are using the proverbial gun in the room to benefit themselves at our expense, or to control us and our kids, or to dominate us in the economic sphere in some way. Let's try to reduce that as much as possible.
I like what you're saying there, and I'm totally on board. And I think what we're demonstrating here is we can have these kind of conversations.
Yeah.
An independent with a libertarian on your screen right now having good conversations. And if
Yeah.
you're looking at the U.S. and you say, "Hey, I like what they're doing down there, and Trump is doing a good job, and I would like to have Doge," and look at that, the states have some power. They might be able to go after Fauci, even though he got a federal pardon. The states can still do things.
Mm-hmm.
If you're looking at the U.S. and thinking that, you might be suffering from Republic envy. Stop suffering from Republic envy. Go to notmyking.ca, join the movement, and let's head in a direction where you actually get to be one of the forefathers and help define that. There's going to be people like Russell and myself working on this, because you bring up a lot of good points, and I don't think a lot of Canadians are going to disagree with you. And I do think we have the opportunity with people like us and shows like this to do exactly that. Have these conversations, and let's not be envious of the other systems. Let's go ahead and have one ourselves.
Yeah,
so I'm going to keep pushing that. And I just want to let your viewers know, 6 p.m. Mountain, 8 p.m. Eastern tonight, I have Bruce Party on, who's a law professor out of Ontario, and he's a constitutional drafter, basically, and we've been having conversations, so he's going to be talking about what that could look like if we're heading in the direction of a republic. And we'll be joined by Catherine Kolowich, who's a lawyer from Alberta, and she was the former interim leader of the Alberta Independence Party. So we're going to have a conversation about, is Alberta the place for this to happen? Can we actually ignite Alberta enough? And I'm going to tell you right now, Russell, I am not alone. There's a whole bunch of patriots behind me. I'm trying to be the diplomat right now. I'm trying to hold them back. But there's a whole bunch of patriots behind me that want to separate and become our independent state right now. Whether it's the 51st state, whether it's the first state of Canada, Alberta might be the place to have this. So 6 p.m. tonight, I'm having a great conversation with these two people about why Alberta might be the place for this to happen. And then right after that at 8 p.m. Eastern. No, that's Central, 8 p.m. Central. So 7 p.m. Mountain, 9 p.m. Eastern. I'll be on Shadow Davis, where we're going to continue this conversation as well, because I think it's time. I think it's time that Canadians think about it. So come join me at notmyking.ca, and let's have this conversation and keep it going.
Right on, Jason. Well, I won't keep you much longer because, like I say, I just want to engage in this conversation, and you didn't disappoint me. I expected as much, and this is the way it is this, and this kind of helps alleviate a lot of my concerns. Is I recognize that if we Canadians can just sit down and talk to each other. And once again, I'm definitely not adverse to a republic. It would definitely be a step up from the current situation we have now. So once again, is all I offered is just like if we were doing this thing, is I just want to be that one. And I would expect anyone, if you're truly interested in liberty and trying to get it as best figured out, is not just my voice, but people like Bruce Party, who does come from that legal scholar field, is bring lots of Canadian minds together, because once again, we all have our blind spots, and this is the area where we can fill in those gaps, is finding and pushing back against each other. Because you got to imagine, well, actually, you don't even have to imagine, it's actually right there. Actually, you can't see it behind me, but when the founding fathers were drafting the Constitution, there was a lot of arguing and bickering back and forth on whether you're talking the Federalist Papers or the Anti-Federalist Papers, right? Because there were proponents from both sides of federalism or not federalism, right? So but what they ended up coming to is people that come at it from a full-on anarchist bent, and people that come at it from more of a minarchist and a Republican bent. But all those great minds came together, and what you ended up was the greatest experiment in modern history in terms of individual liberty, America. And it went from being a ragtag 13 colonies to the most dominant, powerful nation on the planet. So we know that this has possibility, but this is, like I say, what I think is most important for us today is to do these things, come together, have this kind of dialogue and conversation. And when the time does come where we are in a position where maybe enough Canadians have finally had enough with the status quo and the way things are done, and I think that's probably going to happen, hopefully sooner than later, based on how insane things have gotten, especially under the Trudeau regime, then I think we would be in a much better position, because then we're not just scrambling to try to catch up, right? We're not caught with our pants down, so to speak. So let's have these conversations now, figure this stuff out. And once again, me and Jason proved, well, I knew already that you were willing to have a good faith conversation, which is why I like talking to you. This is what you do, folks. We're two grown adults, right? No point in taking anything personal. I don't take anything that Jason's saying personally, even when he disagrees with me, because I recognize, listen, I disagreed with myself not so long ago. That's the whole thing and that's why it's nice to engage in these kinds of conversations, because Jason brings up things that I never thought of, and I bring up things that maybe he didn't think of. And that's the beautiful thing about engaging in this kind of dialogue, is it raises and elevates every single one of us in some way. So once again, Jason, it's been an hour and a half. I kept you long enough. I know you're a busy man. You're on a stream and tirade today, it seems. Basically, I think you got 4 of them on the go today, right? So I'll leave you to get to the rest of yours. But is there anything else that you want to add before I do let you go, Jason?
I wanted to thank you. You keep doing what you're doing. I really like the idea of having these conversations, and I really like the idea that you're pushing a libertarian mindset. I'm not far from you at all. I'm really not.
Right.
I think we're very close. In fact, in an ideal world, independent people and libertarians would come together and we'll nail it. And when they were working on their documents down south, they all agreed on one thing: we're not a monarch anymore. So there's at least one place to start. So that's where I think we can get to.
Yeah, no, I agree. I agree with you there 100%. At the very least, Canada can at least throw off the shackles of the monarchy, because it's been a long time coming, right? But yeah, I definitely agree with you there, Jason. And that's the best way to end, anyways, folks. So you folks have a good time for the rest of your day. Enjoy the weekend when it gets here, and I'll see you in the next live stream. It's Canadian Libertarian, and I love liberty.